Okay, Richard, you should be on.
You're good.
So you want to give an introduction?
Sure. Welcome everyone to the National Security Youth Forum, hosted by the National Security Forum of Northern Nevada. I guess we're coming live from my room as many of this is taking place. This is, I think, our third, and this is our second virtual, and we're kind of tweaking this as we're trying to figure out how to go through this post-pandemic life. And so throughout the day, we're going to have a series of guests who are going to come in and talk about how we got to the Ukrainian conflict and where we're going to head from here. We are very honored to have representatives from George Mason University, and they are joining us virtually, as well as guests who are in my classroom. And Maureen, you can introduce them as they come into Mr. Carlin, Mr. Kiwi's class. Welcome. I hope you have questions and you get a lot from this. We can't get any more current on things going on in the world than this. So without further ado, Maureen, I'll turn it over to you and to Greg, and thank you all for being here.
Excellent. Thank you all. Thank you, students. We're thrilled to have you here. I'm Maureen McCarthy. I am the program director for the National Security Forum in Northern Nevada. So we do virtual programs. We're an organization that is dedicated to promoting civil discourse on challenging international and national security issues. And so it's our pleasure to be able to host these every year. This year we've partnered with George Mason University, and the purpose of the event today is to give you some information to help you navigate the world. You're all seniors, correct? You're all headed out into the big old world, going to college, going to change the world. Future policy leaders, we need you in government. So this is a little bit of a flavor to help you think about, as you move forward, navigating the world that is really at war, and the war in Ukraine is affecting everybody everywhere, even if you were not directly engaged in the fighting. So we just wanted to be able to give you some information, some food for thought, some contacts, some people to think about. All the materials will be posted on our website. So Mr. Clark has sent out those links, so he'll give you more background information. And so without ado, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Koblenz. Professor Koblenz is at George Mason University. He specializes in W&D countermeasures, so chemical, biological, nuclear issues, but he's an expert in all fields of national security. He's from the Schar School in Public Policy and Government. And for those of you who may be interested, the Schar School is a fabulous university in Washington, D.C. They have a fabulous master's program, if you think about it, after your bachelor's program. And our recruiter is here for the day, and they gave you some information. So with that, Greg, why don't you take it away and start your introduction?
Great. Thanks, Maureen. Really nice to be with everyone today. Unfortunately, this is the background, Zoom background for our campus in Arlington, where it's always sunny. Unfortunately, it's cold and rainy here today, but glad to be with you guys. Like Maureen said, I'm an associate professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government, which is part of George Mason University, and I direct our biodefense graduate program. So I do a lot of work in the area of biodefense and biological weapons, but I got my start working on nuclear nonproliferation issues. So I cover the full spectrum of WMD, and I teach both in our undergraduate program on government and politics and in our graduate level program. So if any of you are interested in careers in foreign policy or national security or homeland security, definitely encourage you to learn more about the Schar School and the ways that we offer some opportunities and pathways to those kinds of careers, and being located, within the Beltway is definitely a good advantage. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple different dimensions to how weapons of mass destruction have influenced the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And WMD have shown up in a couple of different ways. First, as part of Russia's justification for the invasion in the first place. Secondly, during the conduct of the war, there have been dimensions related to nuclear and chemical weapons. And finally, a lot of the risks of escalation of the conflict that people are worrying about now are related to weapons mass destruction. And I'll just note at the outset, I'll use the term WMD a lot, which is not a term I really like, but it is easier than saying nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, which is the three types of weapons are included in that broad category of WMD. So just to start off with, Russia, when it invaded Ukraine on February 24th, one of the many justifications they offered was that Ukraine posed a threat because of their development of nuclear weapons and biological weapons. And this was somewhat reminiscent of the US case for invading Iraq back in 2003, where the United States claimed that Iraq had WMD and posed a threat to international security and was in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, which, as we all know, right, that intelligence was wrong. Iraq did not have any actual weapons of mass destruction in 2003. And we can go, there's a whole debate about why we made those, why we got the intelligence wrong. But the case for Iraq having WMD was, even though it was wrong in the end, there was a much, much stronger basis for thinking they might have those weapons back then than there is for thinking that Ukraine has any kind of WMD programs today. And Russia has put forward very little evidence supporting its claims. So, on the nuclear side, President Putin and some of the other senior Russian foreign policy folks, right, they will mention in passing, oh yes, we think Ukraine was developing nuclear weapons, or Ukraine was thinking about developing nuclear weapons, but they provided zero evidence, zero information. It's literally just a one or two sentence, and part of their litany of grievances against Ukraine, and there's no evidence. And before the invasion, these issues were never raised. They never went to the IAEA, which is the international organization charged with ensuring that countries don't develop nuclear weapons, and never went to IAEA and claimed that Ukraine had a secret program or a clandestine program or was buying, uranium on the black market or anything like that. So they just kind of made up this allegation on the eve of invading Ukraine. On the biological side, there's a long history of Russia accusing some of its neighbors, like Ukraine and Georgia, of housing US military labs that are doing biological weapons research. And this is an allegation Russia's been making for many, many years, that they target at former Soviet republics that they're not on good relations with. So, back in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia because Georgia is becoming, too interested in joining NATO and joining the European Union. And ever since then, whenever the United States works with Georgia to build a public health lab or engage in scientific research, Russian disinformation comes out saying, oh, this is part of a US bioweapons program in Georgia. They've made similar allegations in the past on Ukraine, kind of every now and then, but that became a real theme of their disinformation shortly after the invasion, that the United States, which was, the kernel of truth there was the United States was working with Ukrainian labs on biological research, on public health surveillance, on biosafety, all for legitimate purposes, all done very transparently and openly. But Russia has twisted that and distorted that into, this is all research being done to support a bioweapons program in Ukraine, right? And therefore we have to invade this country because they're a threat. And they've made these allegations, not just from the Kremlin, but they've had 3 meetings with the United Nations Security Council now devoted to this topic, as well as several other international fora. So this is, a major theme in their narrative for why they needed to invade Ukraine. And again, there's absolutely no evidence that this is the case. And a lot of their allegations, quite frankly, are just outlandish and ridiculous. So for example, they've tried to make it sound suspicious that Ukrainian labs are doing research on Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, which is a distant relative of Ebola and other hemorrhagic viruses. And by the name of the virus, right, you might guess that it's endemic in Ukraine, right? It is named Crimea Congo hemorrhagic fever for a reason. It was actually discovered in Crimea in 1944. So it makes perfect sense for Ukraine to be studying this virus because it's endemic in their country. It poses a real current public health threat. And so they need to understand how the virus works and its ecology and how it can spill over from animals to humans. The Russians have accused the US of studying bats and bird migration patterns in Ukraine in order to develop these vectors for delivering biological weapons, which is a very crude way of engaging biological warfare. At the same time, they've also accused US and some of our allies like Germany of taking blood samples from ethnic Russians in order to develop a bioweapon that's targeted just at ethnic Russians. So an ethnic bioweapon, which would be incredibly advanced, sophisticated, Michael Crichton sci-fi level bioweapons capability. And yet they think that the United States needs birds and bats to deliver the super advanced biological weapon. So their allegations are just on many levels really just not credible at all and just bizarre, ridiculous if you know anything about the science of what's going on. But they've been very persistent with these allegations and again, using things like the United Nations Security Council to try and spread the disinformation and legitimate it. So this is an area where they've been very, very active. So WMD have focused very heavily in their justification for the war, but they've done it in a very weak way where there's no real evidence that you can actually pose a threat in this regard. And most countries recognize that, but unfortunately, there are some countries that are either Russian allies or they want to curry favor with Russia, who will treat these allegations seriously, which is not good. We've also seen WMD issues arise during the course of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which I think we're now into the past 3 month mark. And this has been a lot of concerns about radiological threats and also chemical threats. And so the first big issue to emerge was Chernobyl, which was the reactor that had a major accident back in the 1980s. Currently, not operational at all, and there are several thousand tons of radioactive waste basically entombed at the site in this giant concrete and steel sarcophagus to make sure that doesn't leak out into the environment. And the Chernobyl site is in northern Ukraine, right next to the Belarusian border. And so as Russian forces based in Belarus came south into Ukraine, right, they went through the exclusion zone around Chernobyl, designed to keep people away from the more radioactive areas. And Russian forces actually occupied the reactor site. And this caused a lot of concern that fighting around the reactor would, breach the sarcophagus and unleash radioactive, materials into the environment again. This actually is fairly low risk, in part because, this containment structure around the waste at Chernobyl is just massive in terms of its size. And unless Russia was trying to deliberately breach the containment dome, right? Even if there is an errant, one artillery shell or one rifle bullet, it's not really going to cause a major release. But it definitely, because everyone knows about Chernobyl, and there's a great HBO miniseries on Chernobyl if you haven't seen already, that everyone just associates Chernobyl with radioactive disaster. So any kind of military activity around there definitely raises people's concerns. What was a little bit more dangerous, though, was a Russian assault on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear reactor site in southeast Ukraine, which has 6 active nuclear reactors at the site. And Ukraine actually has a very big nuclear power industry that generates about half electricity in the country. And this was the first time that a nuclear reactor site came under assault during an active military conflict. So this is kind of unprecedented for there to be actually fighting on the grounds of this reactor complex. The good news is, the bad news is there was fighting there. The good news is the damage was very limited. There was basically one training building that was damaged. None of the reactors were damaged in any way. And in fact, only I think 1 or 2 of the reactors were actually online at the time. The rest have been shut down for maintenance or other purposes. So the risks of this kind of attack, creating another Chernobyl was extremely, extremely low. And also these are reactors that are much more modern than what was in Chernobyl, because one of the problems that the Soviets had with the Chernobyl accident is the Chernobyl reactor didn't have a giant concrete containment dome outside the reactor. So once the reactor had a meltdown and there was an explosion in the building, right, there's nothing to keep that radioactive material inside the building. All of these reactors at Zaporizhzhia have these massive concrete domes, which protect both radioactive material from getting out, but also, preventing any kind of errant shooting or shelling from getting into the reactor. So, again, there's definitely risk there and definitely concern, but there was not, an immediate, there was not, no radiation was released, and the threat was, relatively limited. Very disturbing, right? But again, it was not going to lead to a Chernobyl 2.0 version. But again, war is extremely chaotic. In general, the Russian forces have demonstrated, not a great high level of competency, lots of equipment malfunctions, lots of cruise missiles that have gone off course and not hit their target. And there was a reporting of one cruise missile sighted flying over a Ukrainian nuclear reactor a few weeks ago, which, it was not the target, but the fact that the Russians are shooting these missiles and their flight path takes them over these reactors is concerning, because the Russians have had a fairly high failure rate in their different types of missile systems. So, right, we can't rule out an accident from happening or some kind of inadvertent radiological event. So again, having any kind of fighting around these sites is very concerning. But what we've seen on the ground so far is limited. We've seen more active cases of chemical facilities being targeted by Russian forces, and several cases of toxic industrial chemicals being released because of shelling and bombing at these sites. And it's not clear if these were intentionally struck for the goal of releasing these toxic industrial chemicals, things like chlorine, nitric acid, hydrogenous ammonia, that are lethal, dangerous chemicals, and they're stored in very large quantities at these facilities, so they present a real threat to the local population. But not clear if these sites are being targeted specifically for that purpose, or basically they were caught in the crossfire, because Russia is just shooting up a lot of Ukraine's industry as part of their general kind of punitive campaign to kind of break Ukraine's will and force them to the negotiating table. So it's unclear still if this was really intentional chemical sabotage by the Russians, or this was collateral damage. So far as I know, there haven't been any reported casualties from these incidents, in part because so many Ukrainians have had to flee their homes and industrial facilities because of the fighting, and so luckily there haven't been casualties. But again, given how industrialized Ukraine is and how many different sites there are holding potentially dangerous chemicals in it, that there is a risk that these chemicals could wind up causing mass casualties if they're released near a populated area. The final area where we've seen kind of a WMD dimension is concerns about how the war might escalate in the near future. And there are three different ways that this kind of fear has manifested. One has been what people call false flag incidents. A false flag is when one country attacks another country, but tries to make it look like a third party was responsible, and to avoid them being identified as being the perpetrator of the attack. And so the idea here is that Russia would attack maybe a Russian a target in the Donbass or in Russian controlled territory, and then blame the Ukrainians for launching that attack, and then use as justification for Russia to escalate the conflict. Either ordering general mobilization, bringing more troops, bombing new types of targets, or in the worst case scenario, that would give justification for Russia to use its own chemical or biological weapons. And they could say, well, Ukraine used chemical weapons first, Ukraine used biological weapons first, now we're allowed to retaliate. And so there's been a lot of concern that a lot of this Russian disinformation about bioweapons programs in Ukraine and chemical weapon sites in Ukraine was really designed to provide a pretext, a foundation for later claiming Ukraine attacked Russia with chemical and biological weapons to allow Russia to use its own weapons. So far, that has not happened. And I think that obviously that's a good thing. I'm not too surprised at that, because for Russia to use a chemical or biological weapon in Ukraine would be a very serious escalation. I think that the benefits of these weapons would not be that great for Russia, given they have overwhelming conventional military firepower they can bring to bear on Ukrainian targets if they need to. And using one of these banned weapons, right? These are weapons that are banned by international treaties, would really open them up to even greater international condemnation. And doing this right on the border of NATO would also be, I think, very alarming to the entire alliance. And also, quite frankly, given how badly the Russians planned and executed the war so far, I doubt that Putin really has a lot of confidence that his generals could conduct a sophisticated false flag operation with a chemical or biological weapon, right? It's much more likely they would screw it up and the Russian hoax would be exposed, and that would be even worse for them. Another dimension to this is that as Russian losses have mounted over these 3 months, and that they were unable to take Kiev, and they've lost a lot of ground in northern Ukraine, they've made very poor progress in eastern Ukraine, the Donbass. I think that there's been increasing concern, well, if the Russians are going to fail conventionally, might they escalate to the nuclear level? And certain Russian officials, including the foreign minister, including the the Russian ambassador to the UN, have made implicit and explicit threats about nuclear weapons use, and making allusions to we have weapons that other countries don't, and escalation would bring serious risks, and you don't want to go there, and other times being a little bit more explicit about Russian nuclear weapons. And they've gotten less and less subtle over time as their military progress has become more stalled. And just I think a week ago or so, on Russian state TV, they were showing videos of what a nuclear attack on Britain would look like, and just how Russia could wipe out Britain with 1 or 2 nuclear weapons. So that was it was on state TV. It was kind of a fictionalized scenario, but again, because these are all state-owned, Kremlin-run propaganda outlets, right? It was clearly intended to send a message. And so some folks in NATO and in the US have been taking this seriously. And most recently, you had Senator Mitt Romney write an op-ed in the New York Times just a day or two ago saying we need to take these Russian threats seriously. We need to, anticipate Russia using a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon somewhere in Ukraine as part of their effort to bring the war to an end or to force the Ukrainians to capitulate. And we need to be prepared with how we're going to respond to that. And this is a real threat in the sense that Russia does have a large stockpile of low-yield, quote-unquote, tactical nuclear weapons, right? So not the things that are on these giant ICBMs that can fly thousands and thousands of miles, right? These are relatively small nuclear warheads on short-range ballistic missiles, short-range cruise missiles, or bombs that would still have, the explosive power equal to what, was used to destroy Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but they're small relative to the gigantic warheads that we and they have on our large intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so, so there's been a lot of talk in the press and folks about the risks of Russia using these weapons. I think those risks have been inflated by a lot of people because I think Russia wants us to be afraid of them using nuclear weapons because that's one of the few things they have to deter further NATO involvement in supporting Ukraine. It's one of the few sabers they can rattle that's effective at all. But I think at the end of the day, they're bluffing. There have been a number of cases where nuclear armed countries, including us and the Russians, have fought and lost conventional wars and not gone nuclear, right? We fought in Korea, we fought and lost in Korea, and Vietnam, and Afghanistan, and Iraq, and Afghanistan again, and we never escalated to using nuclear weapons. Certainly Russia, right? Soviet Union lost the war in Afghanistan, and they did not try and go nuclear to salvage that. I don't see them doing that in Ukraine either. I think the use of a nuclear weapon would be so irrevocably world-changing, and the stakes here are just nowhere near commensurate with what Russia would feel justified using a nuclear weapon. I think the odds of that extremely unlikely for it to be done on purpose. I'm worried about kind of escalation spirals, inadvertent use, accidents happening. But I think the deliberate, intentional use of a nuclear weapon, even a quote unquote low yield nuclear weapon, I think is still very, very low. And so kind of my bottom line for how WMD planned all this is that, these weapons have got a lot of attention in the course of this conflict. Which I think is on one hand a good thing, because it reminds people that, Russia does have several thousand nuclear weapons as we do. And some of these weapons are, deployed out in the field, ready to launch at a moment's notice. And so we have to take these things seriously. Russia does have illegal chemical and biological weapons programs that they're in violation of international treaties. So we need to take that seriously. At the same time, we shouldn't inflate their capabilities, and we shouldn't also assume that they're willing and able to use these things at the drop of a hat. Because I think that there's a lot more calculations that you have to look at in terms of what are their incentives and disincentives for doing so. And there's a lot of things we can do at the strategic level, the policy level, to reduce their incentives and increase their disincentives and deter them from going down that road. And I think that is the more productive way to be looking at these threats, not running with their hair on fire and being openly worried about them using these weapons, but being very proactive and practical and pragmatic about, okay, what can we do to reduce the threat, not just now, but down the line in the future. And that's the kind of work that I do here at the Charter School, and several of my colleagues do as well. And so happy to answer any questions you guys have about these issues during the Q&A. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Greg. I really appreciate that. Susan, I'd like to introduce you. We are very honored to have as a board member for the National Security Forum, Susan Malone, who has an esteemed career in international justice. She served on the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So following on what Greg just talked about, Susan's just going to give a short introduction about what the international justice issues are pertaining to this war or have been in previous wars, and then we'll take your Q&A. So think about your questions.
Sure. Good morning. It's an honor to be here talking to all of you wonderful future leaders here in Reno and in America. Thank you very much for everything that you do to gain the knowledge that you're capturing and going out. Really, I guess you guys are going to graduate here in a couple of weeks. Yep. Go off to exciting careers. So I salute you. One of the opportunities that I had, I was a United Nations senior diplomat and an investigator with the United Nations War Crimes Tribunal based in The Hague, the Netherlands. And we were looking at the former Yugoslavia. We had subcourts in Arusha looking at Rwanda. We had a subcourt in East Timor looking at war crimes. And these are crimes against civilians or crimes against combatants who have surrendered and no longer a threat on the battlefield. So one of the things that we were looking at in former Yugoslavia was the mass killing, the mass graves on all sides, whether it was the Croats, the Bosniaks, or the Serbs. They all committed war crimes against their civilian populations and each other. So some of the things that are being, at least that I'm seeing in the open press for the Ukraine, was some of the Russian tactics, the Russian troops, things like, we have what's called and most of the militaries have something that's called the law of land warfare and the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement means it's an outlined set of rules that combatants can and cannot do in a conflict situation. And one of the things that you cannot do is loot, rape, rob, pillage. All of those are crimes. And then some of them then rise to the level of war crimes. One of the things that we were able to do with the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is we were able to introduce mass rape and get it agreed and brought in at the United Nations level as a war crime. Rape has been, as all of your studies, you know that throughout history, rape has been used as a weapon against both men and women, the civilian populations from the beginning of time. Really, it was used as a weapon of terror, a weapon of destruction, a weapon of subjugating people. So that's being looked at in the former Yugoslavia. We looked at it. It was agreed that rape was then the categories as part of a war crime. We were able to charge those individuals with that was one of the elements of a war crime. In the Ukraine, course, there's lots of reports of people on the ground now. You'll see some of the pictures on TV. You'll see guys in the back, the little thing says, war crimes investigator. And they're gathering information from the living and the dead about war crimes. And the civilians that were taken and brutalized and butchered and killed by what is alleged to be the Russian troops that came in to the Ukraine. In many of these cities, these little small villages, it was a war of, it's a tactic of terror. They came in and you gotta understand too, and look at many of these Russian troops that are there, they're conscripts. They don't have a lot of training, they're sort of forced to join the military. And the Russian military itself, at least in my experience, they're pretty brutal. They're pretty brutal on their own people. And rape has been used as a weapon. You can see that many of these people that they come into an area, for instance, for the Ukraine. It's an area that has a lot of growth, a lot of potential. And since 1992, it's an area that's really westernized. So some of these people that came in as conscripts or Russian troops occupied people's houses, and they had things that they've never seen. They stole. So those are part of the crimes that are being investigated, especially the brutality of gathering up the mayors of some of these the hamlets, the villages, and even some of the bigger cities, taking them away and using them as a force of violence, trying to have them, they were surrendered. If somebody puts their hands up and they're surrendering, they have no weapons, that's now a non-combatant. The civilian population in the same way, but they're gathered up and they're using the kids as a weapon of terror against their parents, because their parents may be someone who's a mayor or a key influential, or someone that people listen to. That's a war crime. So those are being investigated now, heavily and documented within in many of those areas throughout the Ukraine. So those are some of the things you're seeing on the international level. There's the international courts, and they're sending their investigators in. There's investigators that are hired by the Ukrainians, hired people to come in and look at people that are trained investigators to look at a mass grave, and look at when they do a forensic analysis of the bodies of the civilians, and they're primarily civilians. Some of the soldiers that surrendered were taken out. They have one of the things about your little phone. You have your phone here. That's a bit of your phone. It's amazing. You guys see it on TV all the time. Something happens and everybody gets their phone out. They got an instant picture. Now, you're going to take pictures from all sides to see. It's to tell the story. And so they're looking at, they have a lot of footage. A lot of these people have taken a lot of videos. I think you saw one on TV, the Russians marching out some of these prisoners of war. They were surrendered Ukrainian forces that were fighting the Russians, but their hands are tied, and, whether they've been beaten. Once they surrendered, they're no longer a combatant. So and at least under our uniform code of military justice in our military, that's a crime. That's a crime in most other countries. So they're looking at that and documenting those types of allegations and incidents and find out war crimes and crimes against humanity. So it's going to be interesting to see how this unfolds. The Russians are still using tactics they used in World War II. If we go back into history, you probably know it. The Russians went through into Germany, massed artillery, massed rockets. It's a war of terrorizing civilian populations and total destruction of buildings and property. So those are some of the things you're seeing with the tactics, where those type of tactics haven't changed. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. So that gives you a little bit of flavor, just a couple of pieces of perspective on the war. It also gives you some idea that this is going to be with you for many years to come, even if the war were to end. We actually, just today, amazingly enough, we clicked past 90 days. So the war started exactly 3 months ago today. So as you go forward, you are going to be impacted in everything you do, whether it's buying gas at the gas pump or becoming our next generation of leaders. So with that, we will open it up to questions from you and from the other classes. Please, if the teachers in the other classes are moderating the questions, so if you have questions, you can raise your hand, you can speak. we can put things in chat, however you want to engage. I'll do it.
You want to, no, I got it. Or-
Go ahead. If you can speak loud, so you have to speak loud enough that they can hear you.
Okay, so in one of the NSF forums that we watched online recently about the history of Ukraine and Russia, they mentioned like different tactics about, how Russia can approach like the attacks. So what is Russia's strategy at the moment? Encircling Kiev, taking back the eastern part that is primarily Russian. What's their current tactic?
Greg, I'm gonna direct that to you.
Sure. So it looks like Russia's initial plan was to seize Kiev and as much territory as they could early on. And clearly, Putin and his generals expected Ukraine to not put up very much resistance at all. And they thought that this would be a very short, easy war. And they were clearly very wrong about that. And as a result, Russia basically gave up about a month and a half ago. They pretty much gave up trying to get to Kiev, and they withdrew their forces from northern Ukraine in order to refocus them around in the Donbass, which is in the eastern part of the country, which is an area that Russia had already seized parts of in 2014 and 2015. And so their goal is basically, it looks like they have two goals now. One is to create a land bridge between Crimea, which is the peninsula down there in the Black Sea, which they had seized in 2014, but they didn't have a way to drive there from the Donbass. Now that they've seized Mariupol in the southeast of Ukraine, they now have a land bridge that connects Crimea directly to Russian territory through captured Ukrainian territory. So that's been accomplished. Another focus looks like expanding how much territory they have around the Donbass, which is the part of Ukraine that historically has more, Russian-speaking population in it. It tends to have a lot of the heavy industry there as well, and is the area that is kind of more, quote unquote, more Russian than Western Ukraine, where there tend to be more, Ukrainian speakers and more Ukrainian Orthodox versus Russian Orthodox. So there is a bit of a cultural divide in the country between east and west parts of the country. And so Russia's trying to grab as much territory as they can in the east. So that appears to be kind of their major military operations or what they're looking for. But at the same time, they are attacking targets throughout Ukraine, in part to punish the country, in part to reduce their industry and their defense industry, so they can't pose a threat long term. And in part trying to, I think, disrupt supplies coming in from NATO allies like Poland and others that they're flowing in through roads and railways from NATO allies into Western Ukraine. So a lot hinges now on the extent to which the Ukrainians can hold on to their line in eastern Ukraine and around the Donbass and kind of contain the Russian forces, or if they're going to kind of get overwhelmed and then have a military failure that would open up more of Ukraine for Russian seizure. So that's kind of where we're at now.
Excellent, thank you, Greg. And for those, for the students in the class, you're looking at what I've got projected up there is the map that I handed out to you. For you in the other classrooms, I highly recommend, if you want to stay apprised of what the troop movements are, go to the Institute for the Study of War. You can get these, you can actually sign up for the newsletter. It's free at understandingwar.org. And they publish these daily. I pulled the one from last Friday. But they put one out almost every afternoon during the week. So you can get more up-to-date information of exactly what the troop movements are. So excellent, good question. Other questions? Questions from the other two classes? I can't see you very well, so wave if you can.
Hi, this is Mr. Carlin. I have a question from one of my students, if you don't mind.
Please go.
Aaron, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm not too sure about some of the sources that I've seen, but I've seen a couple Ukrainian sources that said a couple months ago that Russia did deploy a chemical weapon in Mariupol. So with that, I'm sure, what should I believe on that, or should I just
Yeah, that's a good question. So there was an incident, yeah, like maybe a month or so ago at that big steel plant in Mariupol where the Ukrainian forces were holding out for a very long time. They released a video saying that there was some kind of chemical used and that there were people who were, had kind of a variety of symptoms. One of the issues that we've had, not just in this context, but looking at previous conflicts is, there are lots of toxic chemicals that can cause, bad health effects. But you can have similar symptoms for other reasons. So what it looks like happened is at this incident at this steel plant in Mariupol, right? There are lots of industrial chemicals sitting around this facility. There are there's fighting going on, and so to the extent that there was some shelling or bombing of a part of the plant that had some toxic chemicals in it, it looks like that's what was released. And also if you burn metal, if you burn certain types of metals, the fumes that are created are toxic as well and can create neurological symptoms and other kinds of problems. And it looks like that's what happened. Not that Russia used sarin or mustard, which are military chemical weapons, but because they're fighting in an area that has lots of just chemicals in it because it's a big industrial plant, some of those chemicals got released, or the fumes from the damage from the damaged plant were causing people to have serious problems that look to people on the ground like this could be a chemical attack, right? Because they don't actually have a diagnostic kit that can tell them, what kind of chemicals involved. They're not experts, but because there's been all this talk about Russian use of chemical weapons, I think there also was a bit of a bias that they figure, well, if people are suffering symptoms that that are unusual and they weren't shot, they're just kind of that there's some weird colored smoke, and so it must be the Russians using chemical weapons. It looks like that was not the case, and it looks like that was kind of a mistaken allegation made by those forces at the Ukrainian steel plant. And again, that's not uncommon in a lot of conflicts, but we've seen, but if Russia used real chemical weapons, it would be much more dramatic and obvious in a couple of different ways. So, but again, it's good to keep an eye on these kinds of incidents and allegations, be able to say, look, this was not a chemical attack, because that will then help us understand when a real one happens, we'll be able to identify it better.
Yeah, let me just add on to that too. One of the things that you're seeing in this type of warfare, or any type of warfare, we call it information warfare. It's propaganda. So it has to be examined very carefully to find out what's the ground truth. Was it or wasn't it? There's a lot of ways that the air is sampled, ground is sampled. So you have a lot of different people on the ground taking those samples and trying to determine what occurred. So you have two things. You're looking to see what occurred, was it or wasn't it? If it was, what type was used? If it wasn't, what caused it? But then you also have to layer on top of that, it's a great propaganda piece, information warfare to energize your population and your people to say, hey, they're using chemical weapons against us. Come fight harder. The West, come support us. So you have to factor all of those realities into everything you hear and read. And it's, you have to sift and sort to find the ground truth, and you may not get it right away because the analysis takes a little while to determine what occurred.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Other questions from here? Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah, project.
I was just wondering, what's the difference between now and 2014 when they invaded Crimea, like in terms of the global response to the issue?
Yeah, so there are a couple of differences. First off, Russia was much sneakier with their invasion of Crimea because they used what we call, quote unquote, the little green men, where they had small groups of special forces who did not have Russian flags on their uniforms. They didn't have a massive buildup. They just kind of very secretly infiltrated, all these special forces into Crimea, and then they undertook an operation very quickly to take over the key military bases and other facilities in Crimea. So it happened very quickly, and the Russians kind of got a very strong element of surprise from it. And Ukraine at the time was not, I mean, they had longstanding tensions with Russia, but they were not really on alert. They weren't really prepared militarily to fight back against the Russians. And there's one famous story of, because Ukraine has a long history of corruption in various parts of the country. And there's this famous story of all the batteries from the Russian or from the Ukrainian military trucks that would use to transport troops, all the batteries were gone, either because they've been stolen or because someone had taken the money to buy the batteries and gone off and bought a house or a car, and they never bought the batteries. And so the state of the Ukrainian military was just a mess in 2014. So they couldn't really resist the Russians very well. And the Russians were much more clever about how they engaged in their operation, right? This time, right, the Russians engaged in this massive military buildup on Ukraine's borders, in Russia and in Belarus, which was, provided a very obvious signs that Russia was preparing something, and they weren't really trying to hide it. And then the rhetoric coming out of Moscow was very hostile, and the United States apparently had really good intelligence on what the Russians were planning. And this is why President Biden and senior U.S. officials kept telling the Europeans, like the Russians are coming, telling the Ukrainians, warning the Russians publicly, like, we know what you're doing, because we don't know how or why, but we have really good intelligence. And it shows that, we were right, that this is what Russia was planning all along. So, and now, of course, in 2022, the Ukrainian military is much better developed, much more professional, much better armed than they were in 2014. Because they know the Russian threat is real. They've actually been fighting Russia in the occupied Donbas territory since 2014 or so. So, that's what has changed the situation between now and then. And, and given just how blatant and how massive this effort is by Russia to just seize huge chunks of territory, I think that also accounts for the much stronger international response from not just from NATO allies, but from countries around the world recognizing just how kind of naked and blatant this aggression is. And that's been a change from 2014, which again was, done in a much more clever, clandestine way that made it a little bit harder to kind of mobilize international support very, very quickly.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you all for joining us. I know we had to cut the Q&A off, but all of these programs are going to be recorded. So we're doing 7 sessions today. So if you want to catch some of the other speakers and the other Q&A, please, all of the sessions should be posted by tomorrow on our website. And Mr. Clark will be sending out all the information. Thank you very much, Mr. Carlin and Mr. Peavy, for joining us today. And good luck in your adventures. And please lend your leadership in the world. We will need you in the future. Thank you.
Now, we expect to see all of you as leaders of the future. Learn all you can. Remember the National Security Forum. It's an opportunity for you to, even as you go on in college or wherever you go, who is our National Security Forum? Join us. Help us tell the story through a better educated American public. Know what's going on around you. Stay safe, guys.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Professor Kowalski. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.